Hey guys, welcome back to the basement. This is the second video that I'm getting ready for you practicing artists at home. And we're going to do some follow-up on perspective and look at 2-point linear perspective. Last time we did 1 point. And we're also going to look at value and shading through drawing. Value generally means the lightness or darkness of a color or of a shade of gray or black or white. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. All right, so value. Let's talk really quickly about that. I mentioned it in the last video, but we didn't get into it until today. Using a straight edge or not, you can make a box at the top of your page. And it's an arbitrary number. It doesn't really matter how many boxes you make. So we'll make 6 boxes. 4, 5, 6, okay. And we're going to do a value scale. Excuse my handwriting, it's, again, digital, not my best work. So in the value scale, we're going to number our boxes 1 through 6. You can do 4 boxes, you could do 10 boxes. It's just going to give us a foundation from which to work. And go ahead and write an L on the left and a D on the right, and that's going to represent light and dark. We're not going to work in color because I assume we're just doing some drawing with a pencil, but value applies to all colors and shades of gray, black, and white. For your 6 box, for your darkest box, we're going to go ahead and darken it in as black or as dark as you can get it with your pencil. And then for your 5 box, a little bit lighter. That's a little too light. We want this to be a pretty smooth transition from light to dark, and we want to have at least 6 stages of discernible value. Keep going with number 4, a little lighter than number 5. Number 3. Number 2 is going to be just a light touch, just the littlest bit of shadow. And of course, number 1, we're going to leave completely the white of the paper. We don't want to mess with that too much because we want it to be a representation of our lightest value. So let's look at the basic shapes that make up all things in 3 dimensions. We have the cylinder, which you can make by drawing a foreshortened circle. Foreshortened meaning squished, as if you're looking at it from a harsh angle. So instead of it being round, as if you viewed it from the top, it's tilted away from you. So it has that foreshortened look about it. Speaking of circles, next we'll use a sphere. There's a little lag on my pen. And then we're going to do a 3-dimensional square, which we all know is called a cube. Don't forget your eraser. I never forget mine. And next, after a little cosmetic surgery here, we're going to look at a cone. We could also do a pyramid, but I'm going to stick with these 4 just because of the size at which I drew them. And the pyramid, having flat sides, will follow the same rules as the cube. So when we're thinking about value, we need to think about a light source. We kind of touched on that in the first lesson. If you remember, I drew a little sun. So I'm going to draw a little sun up here. And that'll indicate where our light is coming from. And just like our perspective lines, you can use the lines coming from your sun, your light source, to help you decide the lighting we're going to use on our basic shapes. All right, so next I'm going to mess with my brush size a little, make it a little bigger so I can get smoother marks. So we have a few parts to consider when we're talking about shadow and drawing. We have what's called the core shadow, which will be the area that's darkest on your object. Now if the light's coming and hitting here on this surface, then I know that edge is going to be the lightest. And as we wrap around and think about it in the 3rd dimension, this core shadow here will be the darkest. And then we can start to smooth it out and lighten it up as it comes around the object, the cylinder, and start using at least the middle part of this value scale, at least your 2, 3, 4, 5 in your shadow. and just kind of play with that, kind of overlapping, mixing. We're trying to get a smooth gradient from one shade to the next in our shadow. The Italian term for this, the transition from dark to light with a smooth, almost, a sense that it would be a smooth object, and a smooth transition from dark to light is sfumato, and I believe it just means smooth, but it's been a long time since my first college drawing classes where I learned that. Now over here you'll notice I'm leaving the edge outside of the core shadow a little lighter than the inside of the core shadow. The core shadow is the darkest. That's our 5 or maybe our 6. But we have something that's called reflected light. So even the light that's going around the object will hit this white surface and bounce back a little bit. And so that's where you get your reflected light from. The top of our cylinder isn't getting direct light. It's not coming straight down. So it's going to have a little bit of shadow to it, a little bit of value. And it's just something you can adjust to your liking. I'm leaving this edge lighter because I think if the light was casting across it, it would be a little darker on this end. Now we need to look at, instead of the core shadow, the cast shadow. And using what we learned in perspective and using this as our vanishing point, you can use those same lines to show the shadow that's being thrown out by this object. And just kind of match its shape generally and follow those perspective lines to show your cast shadow. So there's our first object. Now when we're starting on the sphere, we have all curved surfaces here. We don't have any lines, so we need to think about this edge being the lightest. The sun's kind of going to hit in waves around this guy. Sometimes it helps to draw those out. And you can kind of see the curvature of the object through those lines that I've created. Those are called contour lines. And go ahead and start again with your core shadow. That's going to be your darkest. And leave a little room around the edge for that reflected light. You can probably hear my pencil working. Okay, so we have our highlight here, where it would be our 1 or even our 2. And then these marks, with your pencil, you're probably going to get a smoother effect because digitally, I'm still learning kind of to work with these tools to do drawing like this. Usually I just use it for design work. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. Now with the perspective lines on this, we're just going to have to use them kind of as our guide and say we know it doesn't have a base that sits flat on the table, so the shadow would start a little more inside and carry around this way. But it's still falling in line with the perspective lesson that we had the other day. Okay. Cube. Things with flat edges are a little easier for shading. We can kind of just assume that this whole area that's facing away from the light would be the same shade. I'm going to give it like a 3 or a 4. Just try to make that as smooth as you can. Mine isn't very smooth at all because, again, the tools I'm using. And I'm working fast, so of course you can pause this video, you can watch the whole thing, and then slow down and get your materials out and then practice with me after you've watched it all so you kind of know what's coming, or you can just try to work along with me. But I know when I used to watch Bob Ross paint, I used to get really frustrated with how fast he went. Because I thought, who could keep up with that? Okay, still not happy with these edges. Let's look at where this shadow would fall. If it started at this corner and reached out this way, And then we've got another line coming down here. Now we know the shadow is going to fall everywhere behind the corner that's closest to the light source. I'm just going to kind of fake it here. Now we have our cone. The light's coming down right on top of the cone. And so I'm going to operate under the assumption that the light source is a little bit behind the cone, so that our core shadow would be on this edge farthest from the light. And then we'll have a little bit of a lit edge where we can see that the other side of the cone would be very well lit because it would be fully in light. You kind of have to decide your position in relationship to the object when you're shading just from your imagination. A really good thing to do is to set up some actual shapes and practice drawing from observation. Many of you may have heard me say in our art lessons that the best way to learn is through observation in art. It works much stronger than your imagination, but every time you draw from observation, you build a little bit of a stronger toolbox to use when you're drawing from your imagination. So having drawn so many things from observation, from actually looking at them, I'm able to just pull these shapes out of my head and remember how the light behaved, remember how the shapes behaved with the light, and you will be too after some practice. But set up, the classic bowl of fruit, a couple of oranges, a couple of apples. Don't try to draw them in color. I would recommend trying to draw them first in black and white or in shades of gray, monochromatic. And set up a lamp, strong light source, and you'll see just how the light behaves on these objects. Will you scale? That was really bugging me how light that was. All right, so there's your first lesson in value. Again, if you want to ground these objects in space a little better, just like we did with our perspective lesson, you can draw in a horizon. Could have done that initially, but make it look like that's the table's edge. You could even start to fill in color out here so that it's higher contrast, like they're sitting on the edge of a table and there's a dark curtain behind them. That's really up to you. I won't do too much with that. All right, I'm going to pause here and get ready for the 2-point perspective part of our lesson. Okay, 2-point perspective. I realized after reviewing mentally over the video I shot the other day that I didn't call it linear perspective, which is what it is. There are other types of perspective, like atmospheric perspective. Linear perspective is what you use mostly in drawing. So add that to your vocabulary. Okay, so this is going to come as a shock to many of you, but 2-point perspective, brace yourself, uses 2 vanishing points. That's the big secret. We had 1-point perspective, had 1 vanishing point. 2-point perspective uses 2. And instead of drawing your flat surface and then making it draw back to these vanishing points, what we're going to do is we're actually going to draw in our perspective lines first and kind of figure out what we want to draw where they intersect. So I'm just going to give an array of lines here. I'm not using a ruler, but you're welcome to. And you might start to see some things that give you a clue about how this is going to work. So anywhere where these coincide, draw a straight line. And then follow those perspective lines to draw a shape in perspective. And then to the other line, you'll draw the second surface of your object. And then the third surface. So this is another way to draw flat-sided objects in perspective. And now that you've had your value study, you can take it to the next level and drop some shading in on them, and it really starts to make them look like they're standing out in 3D space. So anywhere where two lines coincide, I can draw a line, a vertical line, and then start to draw the shapes, sort of disappearing back toward or drawing back toward that vanishing point. Something about me drawing digitally is on the left side of the drawing, I have a hard time with the angle of my drawing board. Okay, so here's a tricky part. Where do I take this next line? Straight across to the vanishing point. How far back do I go? Well, I go to this other corner and take that to the other vanishing point. So you have two vanishing points working together to establish the surfaces of your objects in this part of the lesson. Oh, I just realized this shading is going to be really inconsistent because I didn't think about this object when I started shading that other one. So let's go ahead and this is the trap I set for myself by not establishing a light source. So I will establish a light source now and say the sun is here. And now we have our light source. We have our shading. You can even draw shapes this far back in space and this close to a vanishing point, and they'll just have a more extreme perspective. Get harder to see the smaller I get probably, but I think you can see the effect. And if I wanted something way over here, then I would use those same perspective lines to make an object. So this is a good way to draw a cityscape from a higher up perspective, a higher up point of view. You could draw, I mean, anything really inspired by Minecraft. I think of Minecraft all the time when I'm giving this lesson because these shapes look like kind of that same style because they're all flat edge, cubic shapes. Now what I've done there is I've put one shape behind another and it's starting to give it a sense of space and a sense of the relationship between the objects because I'm using a technique of overlapping. Space is another lesson I'm going to give further down the road, but for now that can be your little preview and you can mess around with that and see what kind of thing you can make. All right. Oh, well now I have to do this because it's going to bother me. If this thing is above it and the light is here, then we're going to have a cast shadow from one object to another. Cool. I think that's all I'm going to show you for now about two-point perspective. Happy drawing. I can't wait to see what you come up with. Here are a few examples of two-point perspective being used to draw architecture, buildings and streets and things. Try this out.